Hi, this is Chris Smith with Local Joe's. At Local Joe's, we help local business. Hi, this is Chris Smith with Local Joe's.
This is City Pulse Newsmakers, a weekly look at the issues and the people behind them in Greater Lansing. Brought to you by City Pulse, Lansing's weekly alternative newspaper. And now, here's your host, City Pulse publisher, Burl Schwartz.
Good Saturday morning and happy Halloween. As you can see, we have spared no expense on our set today. I think we spent $6.36. It's too bad we couldn't get it to $6.66 for Halloween. We're going to look at some video right now to introduce our topic. Take a look at this.
October 30th, 1938, the night before Halloween in a year when economic uncertainty and approaching World War were far scarier than anything the holiday had to offer. Shortly after 8 p.m., millions of radio listeners tuned to CBS heard startling reports of an armed invasion of the eastern seaboard. Announcers reported that Martian spacecraft had landed outside major U.S. cities, releasing massive fighting machines that killed everything in their path with death rays and poison gas.
All of North Jersey is an inferno. New York City was just demolished.
But the broadcast was not, in fact, real news. Instead, it was an adaptation of the H.G. Wells classic, The War of the Worlds, the work of 23-year-old Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater on the air.
Which, as some of you may remember, sent many thousands of our listeners panicking into the streets all over the country.
The next day, newspapers nationwide reported that thousands of listeners had taken the fake news to be true and fled their homes in terror, grabbing firearms, putting on gas masks, and clogging the highways in a mad rush to escape the imaginary Martians.
One fellow in particular who owned a store took the money from his cash register and loaded his car up with food and took off for the mountains and left his wife and children at home.
These stories of panic generated headlines all over the world and made the name of the young Orson Welles.
Whether all those people who jammed the highways and even took to the hills to escape the Martians have forgiven me, it's another matter.
At least, that's the story.
And with us today is an expert on that subject of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast. He has written a book called Broadcast Hysteria, Orson Welles, War of the Worlds, and the Art of Fake News. His name happens to be Schwartz, A. Brad Schwartz.
No relation.
We are not related, as we are both quick to point out. Brad.
Like Wells and Wells.
Yeah, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You know, it's a absolutely fascinating book about the broadcast, which was in 1938, last night, as we do this show. And it is amazing to me that something that was just a blip in history in a particularly historic time in the world has continued to capture the imagination. Tell me about what interested you in this.
Well, the old-time radio world is one I knew very well growing up as a kid, because my parents, when I was very young, could never get me to go to sleep at night. And so they discovered that they could play these cassettes of old-time radio shows like The Shadow, The Lone Ranger, or Orson Welles' Mercury Theater on the Air as a way of quieting me down. I don't think it helped me get to sleep because the shows were so good that I just kept listening to stay awake. But that introduced me to radio right at the right time, because radio is the theater of the imagination, right? And when you're a kid and you have a very elastic, very expansive imagination, it's you can picture the shows better in your head than television or really anything else can give you. And so I had a real love of it as a very little kid. I heard War of the Worlds probably when I was 6 or 7, and I did a project on it in high school. But it was something that I was kind of aware of and appreciated. But when I got to the University of Michigan as an undergraduate, when I was studying history and film, one day I was taking a film class and a librarian came in and mentioned that the University of Michigan, at that time, this was in 2010, had relatively recently acquired a couple of very large collections of Orson Welles' personal papers that were new. People didn't really know what was in there. Scholars hadn't yet kind of dug into them. They'd only recently been open for research. But among the things that the librarian mentioned we had was about 1,400 letters from people who heard War of the Worlds and wrote to Orson Welles describing their experiences. And as soon as he said that, the light bulb went off in my mind, and I immediately went back to my 6-year-old self listening to these shows as a kid and kind of imagining, knowing the story that the video discussed of the panic broadcast, kind of imagining what remarkable stories were hidden in here that nobody had read in 70 years. And as luck would have it, I needed to do a senior thesis in the history department, and I had this great collection of primary source material in my backyard, so I was off and running. And as I started reading the letters and started diving into the subject, as a roundabout way of answering your question, what I found that really fascinated me and really kept me to it was that I didn't know the story of the broadcast and its response as well as I thought I did. And the true story was a viral media story. It was a 21st century media event in this early part of the 20th century, and the lessons that had been obscured by this panic myth that grew up in the broadcast wake are really more relevant now than they ever have been before, and that's why I wrote the book.
I think I'd be a little concerned about having parents who thought listening to War of the Worlds calmed down a 6-year-old. I mean, it's a scary story.
It is, although it's, to be honest, when I first heard it, I'm not sure I really got it, because it's masterfully done, but it's almost kind of abstract. You don't hear the Martians. It's people talking about the Martians, that you're always kind of 1 or 2 steps removed, looking at it through the perspective of a newscaster. And two, I think, after I've heard people mention September 11th when talking about the broadcast. When you listen to the show, how the Martians attacked New York City, and the announcer is describing the spread of the gas and the clouds through the concrete canyons, and it's taken on, I think, greater resonance since that event, because we can all picture it much better now because we've lived it.
It was written by someone who knew a thing or two about scary stories, right?
H.G. Wells, the original.
But I'm talking about the radio script.
Yeah.
Howard Koch.
Howard Koch, yes.
Didn't he write Psycho?
No. Bernard Herrmann, who did the music for War of the Worlds, and all the Mercury radio shows, went on to do the music for Psycho. No, Howard Koch was a young playwright at the time. This was kind of his first professional job, but he used the notoriety he got from that to go on to write Casablanca, Sergeant York, several other, The Seahawk, I believe. So he became one of the big screenwriters of like the early 40s before he got blacklisted and didn't work in Hollywood again, I don't think.
I may be wrong. I thought Psycho was based on a novel by Howard Koch.
Robert Bloch.
Robert Bloch. This is terrific.
Well, it's Halloween. I had to.
Do you play trivia, Trivial Pursuit a lot?
I should. I think I'd be good at it. I did Quiz Bowl in high school.
Okay. You grew up in East Lansing, and you went to that other school, University of Michigan, and now you're really embarking on what, I guess, unless you screw it up, is going to be a wonderful career. You see yourself writing more sort of pop culture history?
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. The new book is in process. I came out of Michigan with a background in historical research and trained to kind of do scholarship, and also, not to harp on about that other school, but U of M has really one of the best screenwriting programs in the country, and I went through the various stages of it. I wrote a couple scripts, one of which we produced as a short film, and so I learned really the tools of storytelling, because screenwriting, unlike in a book where you have 300 pages to play around with, it's about being concise. It's about keeping the reader engaged, and so I find myself writing in the prose world, applying those lessons, or trying to, and the writing discipline, which is an essential part of making sure you're writing every day. That stuff I learned in the screenwriting program at Michigan, applying that to the narrative nonfiction world.
Have you produced a screenplay yet?
Well, I've written a couple. It's in process. I will say. Yes, it's a crazy world out in Hollywood, but we'll see how things shape up. But I did when I was at Michigan. They have a program where they take there's an introductory screenwriting class that everybody can take, and then from that they select a couple classes of 20, I think, where you rewrite that script, because all writing is rewriting. So you don't just write a script and say, oh, it's great. You have to perfect it. And then out of that, every term they pick 6 students to write a new script, and you work directly with the organizer of the screenwriting program, and you do a new script. And then from those 6, they pick 2, where they take a 100-page feature script, and then you write it down to a 30-minute short film, which is not easy. And then all the film students pitch, essentially, and offer their ideas for how they would produce it or direct it or write the music for it. And so you get kind of the best of, and it's not just the film program, but it's, as I said, the music school, the business school, you often get producing students out of. And we all come together and produce a short film that then is premiered at the Traverse City Film Festival. They had Michael Moore has kind of an open invitation where they would bring him out every year. So I did the whole sequence, and we produced a murder mystery film that I'm very proud of. I think it turned out really well, and we got a nice response at Traverse City. So that's, I had that on the screenwriting side, on the film side, and then to come out with a thesis that became a book. Michigan did really right by me, I would say.
As Orson Welles and Howard Koch worked on the script, do you think it ever occurred to them that the sort of panic that occurred was going to happen?
Wells liked to claim that he anticipated that people would be frightened, but that he was surprised at the number. However, when you look at what everybody else who was involved in the production set, Howard Koch, John Houseman, the producer, everybody down to the people from the Paper Chase. He went on to a great career too. Everybody involved basically said that they were flabbergasted, and that in fact nobody thought the script was any good. Nobody particularly liked the novel. This is a time when science fiction was really kind of seen as kid stuff. You think of Flash Gordon or pulp magazines, and Wells's radio show. They adapted things like Shakespeare and G.K. Chesterton, and more kind of highbrow stuff. So the idea of doing a Martian invasion rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And so what ended up happening was, because Wells and everybody else in the crew thought this show was too silly for anybody to take it seriously, they started making it more and more realistic and more believable, simply because they thought they had to do everything they could to keep the audience engaged. And it turned out, essentially by accident, that they had this response that I don't think anybody anticipated.
I wonder, as the show moves toward its conclusion, it becomes fairly far-fetched, but what happened? Did people stop listening? And so, because I think if you listen to the end, you would know this is ridiculous.
Yeah. If there's the station break about 40 minutes in, where they come in and say, this is the war, Mercury Theater production of war. Yeah. People who stayed listening, certainly the station break knew what was up. The people generally say, well, by that point everybody was out fleeing in the streets. That appears not to be true. But what oftentimes did happen was that people would, as soon as they heard kind of these, it depended on where you tuned in. Like it starts out as these musical programs being interrupted by reports of explosions on Mars, and then this meteor landing in New Jersey, and a reporter goes to the scene, and that's when it opens up and the Martian machines come out and start sweeping across the eastern seaboard, and so you have, at that point, they don't really refer to it very much as Martian. They often use words like invader or enemy. So it's kind of up to your imagination to see what they're talking about. So people who tuned in kind of earlier oftentimes could think that a meteor had landed in New Jersey, and you saw people showing up at the Grover's Mill, the town that's mentioned in the play, thinking that they could see a freshly landed meteor, not panicking or thinking the Martians were invading, but taking that report seriously. And then after kind of the war begins, you had a lot of people tuning in believing that these were Nazis or that there was some kind of natural disaster. There were various different interpretations, and then they would call people up, if they had a, Aunt Mabel in New Jersey, they'd call her up and say, you got to tune in to CBS, something's happening near you. They would call newspapers, they would call police, just trying to verify what was going on. Because, today, if you heard something that seemed alarming, you'd go to Google or you'd look it up on your phone. They didn't have that. The best they could do was to call like a newspaper, go to, walk to a newspaper if they didn't have a phone. That's right.
A gentleman in Lansing who did that.
That's
was
right.
12 years old.
Yes, because that was the only way you could find out if it was real. And so that's why you see these reports of switchboards lighting up in places coast to coast, and because that's the only way people could verify what they were hearing. So if you stayed tuned in, you would have known relatively quickly that it wasn't real. But the kind of the way it went viral, where people started calling other people and spreading the information, and rumors started flying very quickly. A lot of the people who were significantly frightened probably never actually heard the show. They heard these second or third hand rumors that got out of hand and distorted.
If you were to do a modern day War of the Worlds, not based on the script, but the same sort of fear, what would it be? Would it be terrorists? What would
Could
we do
be.
today?
There was just an incident a while ago where the video game Call of Duty, they put out some tweets that looked like a news organization reporting on a terrorist attack in Singapore, because that's what the game is about. And that, I guess some people believed it, although I don't know how many. So yeah, terrorists, it could be anything. The fascinating thing about War of the Worlds that kept me with it was once I understood how it spread in that viral way, I began to see that it does happen all the time. There's an incident I talked about in the book in Mexico in 2011 where these fake tweets about drug cartels attacking schools, because obviously that's a major problem in Mexico and a very believable problem. At that time, these tweets caused kind of a War of the Worlds type hysteria where people rushed to pick their kids up. People were calling other people and the phone lines went out. So yeah, it could be terrorists, it could be some kind of environmental disaster, but these social media we have now, particularly something like Twitter, because it's 140 characters, like with radio, where there's no pictures in radio, right? You have to kind of imagine it. The same thing with Twitter. You can very easily take a 140 character tweet, misinterpret it, or put your own interpretation on it and spread it. So we've taken the forces that caused some degree of hysteria in 1938 and really turned them up to 11. And we live with it now. I think we don't fully anticipate or don't fully appreciate how common those kinds of events are. They happen all the time.
If something happened on this magnitude, I would imagine there would be FCC hearings and because especially if it were on broadcast radio, where you can, to some extent, control what's broadcast. But what was the reaction then? Did politicians get involved the next day?
They tried. It became. We have to be very careful and say that although there was hysteria and as many as 1 million people were involved, although we can't really know for sure how many. It was a very kind of localized and very small phenomenon. Most Americans didn't have any idea that anything had happened. But because so many of these calls were going into newspaper offices and the press kind of got an exaggerated view of what had happened, it became the front page story just about everywhere the next day. And when you have a story that's that prominent, then of course politicians get involved. Everybody had an opinion, even people who hadn't heard the show had an opinion on what it meant about the power of the radio. There was a senator from Iowa who was particularly upset about frightening radio shows, because he spoke about radio shows in much the same way people talk about things like video games today, that they were turning kids into criminals and giving them all kinds of nervous disorders. And so he kind of latched onto this as an attempt to push through legislation that would censor the radio. That didn't go anywhere. At that time, the FCC was very new and kind of uncertain power. They were still trying to figure out how much power they could wield. They were prohibited from censorship, but at the same time they were required to issue broadcast licenses only to stations acting in the public interest, convenience, or necessity, which implies a kind of censorship power. And so they, immediately everybody looked to the FCC. What is the FCC going to do? And because of this large public outcry, really in Wells's defense, against the issue of censorship, the FCC really backed off. And so there was no, Wells would often say in later years that they passed all kinds of laws saying you couldn't do this again, but in fact there really was no official, legal, political response.
This was, in Wells's career, must have been pivotal. He was 23. He had done some theater, but he hadn't done movies yet, I believe.
No,
he was about to.
He'd experimented, but he had this is what sent him to Hollywood. Without War of the Worlds, because yes, he was well known in the New York theater world, and he'd done a lot of anonymous radio work. He was kind of well known because of his radio series, but he wasn't a celebrity, really, at least outside of Manhattan. But yes, this put him on the map internationally, and the notoriety he got from it is what directly got him the famous contract with RKO to write and produce and direct and act in 2 films entirely of his own creation, which leads to Citizen Kane. So without War of the Worlds, you don't have Citizen Kane, certainly.
And as you sit here at 26? 25, and he was 2 years younger. It's even to you, it must be hard to imagine that suddenly at 23 he's internationally known. Yes,
I did I helped write a PBS documentary about War of the Worlds a couple years ago for the 75th anniversary when I was 23, and we were talking. I was talking with the executive producer about the famous newsreel footage of Wells on Halloween morning, the day after the show, when he's explaining himself to the press and very careful on the one hand to sort of say he couldn't imagine that the show would have this effect, and on the other hand not to insult the people who were frightened by saying they were stupid or something. He walks a very careful line in that film. But the executive producer at American Experience, when we were talking about that, said, he was your age when he's doing that. And can you imagine being in that situation, or, surrounded by all these reporters? He was on something like 3 hours of sleep. He didn't know at that time that the show hadn't killed anybody. He could have, as they're doing the show in the end, near the end, there are police in the studio because people are getting all these calls and the police don't know what's going on, so they send a group to the CBS building, and then somebody called in a bomb threat, so there were more cops. So yeah, Wells had every, that morning certainly, every expectation that he could have been arrested, that not only his career would be over, but his life. And then to turn it around and suddenly become this, the most famous man in America, perhaps, would have been a remarkable ride for anybody, particularly at 23.
Didn't just give him his big break, too, because there are a whole group of people whose names are beginning to fade now, but who were big stars, who may or may not have been involved in that broadcast, but they were part of Mercury Theater.
Yeah.
Joseph Cotton and Agnes Moorehead, and you mentioned John Houseman. It's almost hard to imagine that era of Hollywood had this not happened.
Right, because when Joseph Cotton and Agnes Moorehead were involved with the radio series, but not specifically with War of the Worlds, but they came to Hollywood with Wells and to do Citizen Kane. That was, I think, both of their first films, or one of their first films. And yeah, along with them, Wells brought us Everett Sloane, who was in a lot of great films, and The Twilight Zone, and Citizen Kane.
His accountant, Bernstein.
Bernstein, that's
Kane.
right, yeah.
Yeah, I got one right.
Yes, yes. And yeah, a ton of George Coulouris, who went on to be a character actor in many different things. Ray Collins, who's in War of the Worlds, was also in Citizen Kane and Magnificent Ambersons. He plays boss Jim Geddes in that great scene where he destroys Kane's career. Spoiler alert. So yeah, it's Wells kind of transplanted the theatrical that he had put together for the stage in New York to Hollywood, and to great effect. And as I mentioned, Bernard Herrmann, the composer.
The music, yeah.
He conducted the music, the famous dance band, music in between the news bulletins. He goes on to write the music for Psycho and Taxi Driver, all of Hitchcock's films, essentially. And he begins his film career with Citizen Kane. So it's...
And then Citizen Kane itself. I mean, here, imagine the American film without Citizen Kane. It is, many people say it's the best film ever made, still today.
Yeah, it's certainly up there. And the ironic thing about that is it was not a big hit when it came out. Famously, Wells based it at least partially on the life of William Randolph Hearst, the media baron who made some concerted efforts to destroy the film, blocked its advertising from his newspaper, and made sure that it didn't get seen in as much as it should. But it was also, because it was so revolutionary, the photography and the way the narrative is kind of twisted up chronologically. Audiences didn't really get it back in 1941, but it taught generations of filmmakers how to tell stories in interesting and innovative ways, and how to use the camera to produce these really intricate kind of compositions and the deep focus photography. And so while it failed commercially, it was this wonderful, almost like R&D. Filmmakers then took the ideas from it and applied it to other more successful financially productions. So like you don't have Quentin Tarantino, for example, doing things like Pulp Fiction if you don't have Orson Welles doing Citizen Kane.
In the minute or so we have left, can you tell us about your new project?
It's very early days yet, but I'm working on a book about Al Capone and Eliot Ness with a good friend of mine named Max Allen Collins, who's a novelist and is best known really as the creator of Road to Perdition, the graphic novel that became the Tom Hanks film. Mm-hmm. So we're deep into the research on that now, and we should have it in a couple years. A nonfiction, yes.
Excellent.
About the Untouchables.
That's very exciting.
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, you're going to be I predict the next Jim Cash of East Lansing.
Yeah.
Did you ever meet him?
No, but I'm certainly familiar with his work.
Yeah.
Dick Tracy was one of my favorite films, which is a large
Top
part of
Gun,
why we're
I
doing.
think,
Yeah.
was another one.
Yeah.
Well, very good. I really appreciate you having you on the show. And
it was a blast.
I recommend this book. It's a great read. It's available locally in hardcover.
And signed copies at Schuler Books.
Signed copies,
Okemos.
and I'll have a signed copy soon, I hope. But thanks so much for being on with us today.
Thank you for having me. Happy Halloween.
Yeah, we'll see you next week.